Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English 4101. Last video of the semester talking about Giovanni Baptista Gelli's La Circe, or La Circe, or La Circe, or La Ceres, however you want to pronounce it. This is an image here that I got from the Louvre. It's a 16th century image from Italy of Circe transforming Ulysses' men into various animals, which is something that she does. She gives them a potion that turns them into pigs, and this is in Homer's Odyssey. And Odysseus spends many, many years on an island with this sorceress until he finally gets sick of it and decides to return home to his wife, Penelope, but has to leave behind his men who are animals. So the writer of this work, the Circe, is born in Florence, dies in Florence. His dates are 1498 to 1563. He himself is born to a relatively poor family. His father's a tailor, I think, and he himself works primarily as a shoemaker, but starts to get interested in philosophy and in writing in general, and continues in his profession as a working person, while also doing this kind of intellectual work of writing plays, writing dialogues, and manages to eventually get the attention of the Duce, the leader of Florence, and is elevated into becoming the council of the Florentine Academy. So this is the chief intellectual professional body of Florence at the time. And he writes this work, the Circe, when he's about 50 years old. So he's not a young man. The origin of this work is in Plutarch, who lives, of course, long before Gelli does, and also long before the Middle Ages starts. So he's born around the year 46, dies around the year 119. And this pagan philosopher was very interested in the question of rationality, of course, which is something that animated a lot of ancient philosophers, as we've already seen. And if you looked at Plato or Aristotle, you'd also see similar questions. But we saw this, of course, in Philo and Boethius, for example. Plutarch, unlike Philo and Boethius and Ibn Tufal, is very interested in raising the question of whether or not animals have reason and leaving the answer uncertain. Perhaps the life of an animal is better or even more rational than that of a human being. These are questions that he's able to pose because he isn't tethered to a monotheistic insistence on the human superiority to other animals in this world, which is something that both the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share. So Plutarch is free of those sorts of strictures and is able to pose, therefore, the question in a different way. And so in his work, whether beasts are rational, he imagines a dialogue between Odysseus and one of his men who's been transformed into a pig. And Odysseus is trying to talk this pig named Grylus, or grunter in Greek, to become human again. And the pig says, absolutely not. Why would I want to do this? You urge us, we have all these blessings to become human again, but this woman provides us with everything we need, and now you want us to become that most hard-pressed and ill-fated of creatures. And they argue back and forth, and eventually Odysseus has to confess himself beaten. He's been unable to out-argue this pig. So this work is not very well known in the Middle Ages, but in the Italian Renaissance, one of the things we're interested in doing is bringing new light to neglected works from the classical era. And Plutarch's Grylus becomes one of those works. And Gelli writes an adaptation of it that does the Plutarch one better, by imagining Ulysses arguing with a host of different animals. So oyster and a mole, a snake, a hare, a goat, a deer, a lion, a horse, a dog, a bullock, and an elephant. And only the elephant eventually agrees to become human again. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. The work's a hit. It's translated into many languages. It's adapted for the stage, I believe, in France, in a very kind of silly, frothy production. And it's continuously read really through to the present day. And it's a great deal of fun to look at. So you've just read 4 sections of it, 4 animals of it, rather, the oyster, the mole, the deer, and the elephant. And you'll see that one of the things that Gelli does is that rather than simply having it abstractly as an argument between whether it's better to be a human than an animal, he imagines that each of the animals used to be a particular kind of human, and therefore they have a particular standpoint about what it means to be human on the basis of their existence as human beings. None of us, of course, exists abstractly as a human being. We all exist as a particular kind of human, embodied in a certain way, with a certain kind of health or money or political position or nationality. All these things influence, really, I think, what it means to be human for us. None of us live an abstract existence. We live a particular embodied existence, and the same is true for these animals that Ulysses talks to. So the oyster says, well, he used to be a former fisherman, and he really didn't like work. He thought labor was the business of oxen who drudged all year round. When they can drudge no more, are knocked on the head and eaten. What does it mean to be a laboring person? Well, it means you work because you have to work, not because you want to work. You don't have a career. You have a job, and you do that job because you have to. And now that he's an oyster, he gets his housing for free. His food just comes to him, and he doesn't have to work. He can just hang out all day and just not even think about things and just relax. And so to him, of course, it's much better to be an oyster than a human being. Given the choice between having to work all the time and be worried about that, and to build your own house, which you're stuck with. If you have bad neighbors, you can't, you're just sort of stuck there. You put all this money into it. As an oyster, he doesn't have any of those worries. He can just close up shop and just hang out inside his shell and not worry about things. He's not in danger. He does not ever want to be a man again. Ulysses just gives up on that. And the mole used to be a plowman, so he's not really a farmer. He's a farm laborer. He's the person, some of the most ill-paid and dangerous work in this country is performed by these people. And so he's like, well, my food is much easier to find now that I'm a mole. I just dig around underground and there it is. I don't have to wait around and grow it. I certainly don't have to work for someone to bring myself food. It's just there. So he's like, why would I want to become a human again? And Ulysses says, well, you're blind. Don't you want to be able to see? And the mole says, why would that be useful to me? I live underground. I have everything I need down here. And Ulysses says, well, I'd want to be able to see. And the mole says, why not? It doesn't agree with my nature. I am content to be perfect in my own species. Do you desire to shine like a star or fly like a bird? And Ulysses answers very kind of blandly, well, these aren't things that don't belong to us as men. And the mole says, well, the reason you need to see is because you can't get things you need without seeing. That is, your supposedly superior senses are signs, rather, that you have this extra level of need that can't be satisfied without extra effort. He says it's just much easier to be a mole, and the sign of the easiness of that is that I can't see. Why can't he see? Because he doesn't need to see. Seeing, therefore, is not a sign of ability, but rather a sign of a dependency or disability or vulnerability. So we see the way that, very interestingly, philosophically, the mole switches the standard way of thinking around it in a kind of typical mode of the philosophical paradox. You think this thing is an ability, actually it's a disability. So Ulysses, of course, is defeated by the mole as well. He also has an argument with a deer who used to be a very particular kind of human. She was a woman, and she says, do I want to be a human again? Not unless you change the entire political system to allow women equality. You treat us like slaves. And why would I want to be that again? No, I would rather be a deer if these are my choices. To be a woman in the current political situation, absolutely not. Better to be a deer. And what we have in that argument, once you read it, is you'll see that Ulysses says the nature of women is just to chatter all the time. You talk too much, and look at you, you're talking too much even now. And there's a way then that Ulysses says, you seem to sound like someone who's reasonable, but in fact, language with a woman is not a sign of reason, it's a sign of irrationality. And we can see the way that Ulysses' prejudice against women, his sexism, or even his misogyny, basically drives his sense of what it means to be a human being as well. He excludes her from that, even though she's speaking with him like a rational animal. Finally, the only animal that Ulysses can convince to become human again is the elephant. Why is that? Because the elephant used to be a philosopher. So to be a philosopher, well, it requires a certain amount of funding and privilege and comfort. We saw that Philo had it. We saw that Boethius had it prior to his imprisonment. And Gelli is very unusual in being a shoemaker. In fact, he's kind of famous for having been a shoemaker for most of his career, simply because so few philosophers have that kind of working life. Most of them, certainly in the ancient world, are born into privilege and therefore comfortable. So for for an elephant to return to being human when it used to be a philosopher is really no big deal. All it has to be convinced of is that human reason is superior to animal sense. And it's an abstract argument about different kinds of thinking. And once the elephant realizes that its sensory abilities don't allow it to be as correct as the kind of super sensual quality of reason, well, the elephant says, well, I'd rather be correct than incorrect, so I want to be a human being again. And it has nothing to do with its own personal comfort, because that's already taken care of as a human. When it was a philosopher, it presumably was pretty comfortable. So what we have here, we could put it in conversation with a work like this, David Benatar's book, Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, which is written about in a variety of places, including Joshua Rothman's article in The New Yorker in 2017, The Case for Not Being Born. And Benatar poses the question of whether existence itself is actually an ill. He says most people, their lives are pretty uncomfortable. We're always a little bit hungry, or a little bit tired, a little bit too cold, a little bit too warm. We've got to work, and we want to stay young and healthy, but eventually we get old, and eventually we die, and we're afraid of that, and we experience pain. And so Benatar says, if you kind of add it up, on average, it's really existence is worse than non-existence. So it's better not to be born. Of course, David Benatar continues to write philosophy. He's still with us. He's not leaving us any place. So it really is a kind of strictly philosophical exercise. But looking at the way that the mole and the oyster talk, I think we can imagine them having a conversation with David Benatar, and the three of them getting along pretty well, talking about whether it's better to exist than not to exist. But returning to Gelli, and this is my last slide, on the human condition, really, I think what distinguishes him from so many of the people we've been reading this semester is his attention to the particularity of human existence. Again, none of us exist as abstract humans. We exist as particular kinds of humans in particular kinds of social systems, some of which are better than others, many of which are more comfortable than others. So we can pose the question of what happens to the category of the human once we start looking at particular kinds of humans. So we have this kind of abstract notion of human versus animal. Well, what do we mean by human in such situations? What kind of people are we talking about? We can also look at the way the dominant class of humans seeks to protect itself, its privilege, and a sense of superiority. That although the deer is making a very good argument for why her particular condition as a woman is not that great compared to being a deer, when she's speaking, Ulysses refuses to hear her and says, everything you're saying is just jabbering, because women just like the jabber. So the more she talks, the more she reasons with him, the more she convinces him of her fundamental feminine irrationality. So we can see the way that prejudice inserts itself into the questions of human privilege as well. And then we finally can pose the question of this: if the true goal of being human is to surpass limitations, which is one of the things that Ulysses says to the elephant, then is there any value in being human in itself? So if we go back and look at the elephant, we can see here that man, by advantage of his free will, may pursue a more or less worthy end as himself pleases, either by abandoning himself to those things that are below him, or else by aspiring to those that are above him. So he can either descend to being an animal or sort of rise up into the stars. But it seems that being a human, really, according to this rational philosophical tradition, and something we've seen in Philo, something we've seen in Boethius, something we've seen in Ibn Tufayl, is that really you can either be an animal or you can be something better than an animal. But being human is really nothing in itself. It's about being poised at that moment of choosing either to go down or to go up. And so ultimately, these kinds of humanist philosophies that we've been encountering really don't make much space for being human in itself. So I'm looking forward to our conversations this week about that. Thanks for listening.